Hello, hello. It's really nice to see that you are enjoying these moments together. But we should start, otherwise we are not on time. So I invite you to take your seats, and then we can start. Okay, so Guten Morgen, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second day of the FEBA Annual Convention 2022. This event, as you know, is held in presence in Berlin, but it's also we also have the live streaming on our website. And especially for those who are following the streaming, you can have a look at the program on our website, and it will be possible to find on the website afterwards all the materials, all the presentations, and also to watch the video recordings. So the website is annualconvention.eurofoodbank.org. And the videos are also on our FEBA YouTube channel. Should you wish to interact and ask questions, it's always possible to send an email to annualconvention@eurofoodbank.org. Also, any kind of comments or feedbacks that you have about this event. And then, without any further ado, we will start the international panel that we are hosting this morning. And I'm very pleased to call on the stage Iseult Ward, who is the CEO of Food Cloud, who will moderate the panel discussion. And together with Iseult, the speakers, so we have Brooks Reed, who is Vice President for Business Development at CAF America. Welcome. We have our President, Jacques van der Schrik, President of the European Food Banks Federation. Then we have Frederike Meister, and I hope that the pronunciation was fine, who is Senior Advocacy Director at Global Citizen. Welcome. And last but not least, our friends from the Global Food Banking Network, who are represented today by Chris Repstock, who is Field Services Director. Welcome. So I leave it up to you, Iseult, to join and, to manage this panel conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to thank all of our panelists, particularly those who've traveled further than most, for joining us this evening. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on this international panel. So to kick off, I'd like each of you to take just 2 minutes to introduce yourself and your organization, and we might start with Brooks, if that's okay.
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me today. My name is Brooks Reed. I'm the Vice President for Business Development at Charities Aid Foundation America. We at CAF are a global platform for international philanthropy. We help donors in the US, Canada, and the UK give to charities all over the world. At CAF America, that means that we maintain a database of 2,000 to 3,000 charities at any point and help donors, particularly corporate, individual, and foundation donors in the US, give for charitable purposes all around the world. Over the past 3 years, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've specifically given grants to support food security in Europe, valued at $8.8 million. Of that, $7.4 million went directly to food banks, and $2.6 million of that has been given since the invasion of Ukraine. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk about how our work can support yours.
Good morning, everyone. I don't think it's necessary to introduce myself, but very pleased to see you all this morning. I think FEBA has faced many challenges in the last two to 3 years, and that the last one, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is probably, as I said already, the biggest challenge that we have to face. Let me take already this opportunity to say thank you to CAF America for the cooperation with FEBA, and I think I will give more time to the other panelists so that they can tell us more about themselves. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Friederike Meister. I work for Global Citizen. And Global Citizen is an advocacy platform working to end extreme poverty and achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And our movement is supported by global citizens around the world that take action with us. And taking action means signing petitions, tweeting, posting, voting, even calling leaders from governments, from corporates, from philanthropies, to urge them to step up and create an equitable, healthy, and sustainable future for everyone. I'm Global Citizen Senior Advocacy Director. I'm heading up our campaigns and government relations across Europe. And I'm looking forward to discussing with my further panelists today how we can kind of work together and face those huge challenges Jacques just alluded to. Thank you.
Guten Morgen. Mein Name ist Chris Rebstock, and that's the end of my failed German. Despite having German heritage, I do not speak the language. I've been fortunate to be able to actually be a food banker for my whole career. Started in food banking back in 1980. And worked as the director of a food bank, and then with Feeding America, the national network of food banks, and now with the Global Food Banking Network. And one of the joys of that opportunity in my life has been meeting literally thousands and thousands of incredibly committed and creative and innovative people developing programming to provide primarily support for those food insecure around the world, and also those focused on the environmental issues related to food loss and waste. And it's a true privilege to be with our colleagues here in food banking in Europe, because I don't get frequent opportunity to step outside of our own network and see what's going on in another wonderfully developed and effective system. And it's great learning from you all. Very happy to be here. The Global Food Banking Network was created in 2006 with a dual mission of supporting food banks where they exist, as well as helping develop food banks in countries where they're needed and can be viable. And we do that by providing training and technical assistance, by building partnerships with global corporate and multilateral organizations, conducting research and data collection and analysis, building global program support for child feeding programs, nutrition education programs, food loss and waste processes, and increasingly in the last few years, providing financial support to food banks around the world to help with capacity building and program development and expansion. And it's this last part, the capacity building and the investigation and sharing of innovative and creative programs that is so integral to the discussions that we've been having here the last couple of days. And I'm particularly interested in hearing how that has evolved even more from Jacques as we go through this panel. So it's great to be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you all for that. Chris, if you don't mind, I'll stick with you for a moment. The food banks globally, and many of those in the room, have really stepped up in the last few years in response to the multiple crises we've dealt with. And I believe this has really changed the profile and the visibility of food banks. How have your organisations in the GFN network experienced this? And Jacques, if you don't mind, I'll ask you the same question after.
Okay. Well, before COVID, before the COVID pandemic hit us, we had started down a path, just shortly before that actually, had started down a path of trying to deepen and expand the way that we engaged with our food banks. We're currently operating in about 50 different countries. And at that time, it was fewer. It was around 32 or 33. And while there was some significant breadth to the network, the depth of our engagement with each of our members was much more shallow, and it tended to focus around working with the food banks to achieve certification by the Global Food Banking Network, because we heard from many of our donors very often, and this grew out of our experiences with Feeding America before GFM was created, that having a set of operating standards that was consistent and high level for food bank administration and operation was very important to the food industry and other stakeholders that provide resources to food banks. And so we created a certification program. And prior to COVID, our engagement with the food banks was mostly around managing that certification compliance, if you will, and learning from that what issues needed development in food banks so we could create technical assistance and training resources for them. But we decided that wasn't really an effective way to engage with the food banks, and that we needed to dig deeper into our understanding about what their challenges were, what the opportunities in front of them were, so that we could help them to identify ways to overcome those challenges and seize those opportunities. And then COVID struck, and all of a sudden we couldn't travel anymore. And so we're trying to figure out how to deepen this engagement while sitting behind our desks in Chicago in order to do it. And we went into a process of regular Zoom meetings with the leadership and the teams of our food banks, and started to pursue, especially given the implications of COVID, what it was that they were struggling with and how COVID was forcing them to change their business models and redesign what their programming structure looked like in order to respond to the huge increase in need that was presented as a result of the economic implications of the pandemic, and at the same time, the incredibly deep cuts in available food for donation. Some of our members were built around the concept of collecting and redistributing prepared food, for example. They handled very little, if any, packaged and shelf-stable product. They were completely focused on prepared food. And of course, when the pandemic hit and countries went into lockdown, there was no prepared food because there were no weddings anymore. There were no corporate events. There were no conferences like this. And so hotels and caterers and the typical sources of that product disappeared, and food banks had to pivot in order to figure out how to acquire product that they could prepare ration kits and distribute those ration kits for people to use at home, or for congregate types of agencies that they were supplying would be able to use to serve their residents, you know, shelter homes and orphanages and old folks' homes and drug and alcohol rehab facilities and those kinds of organizations. And so GFN started a process. We have the world divided kind of in 4 different regions, and each region has one person or a team of people focused on delivering field services and technical support to that region. And so we started a process of digging much more deeply into how they were adapting locally to address the need and trying to create online resources for sharing those experiences and developing written toolkits and training resources to share those experiences. Some food banks came up with some very creative approaches. There's a food bank in Santiago del Estero in Argentina that has been operating its warehouse in the middle of the local wholesale produce market. That in and of itself isn't so innovative. Lots of food banks in many different countries do the same thing. But what this food bank did was recognize the availability of incredible amounts of fresh produce, high nutrition quality, of course, in terms of the products typically received by food banks. And they went out and generated public and private funding resources to be able to build a processing plant across the street from the market. So now not only is their facility located in the market and they're collecting all of that product out of the market in addition to other products, packaged products, and typical food bank fare, they now have this processing facility across the street so that they can take the surplus produce that they're receiving and process it in a couple of different ways in order to extend shelf life, whether it's freezing it or tinning it or canning it, or using it as ingredients to create other products like soups or stews that can then be frozen and shared out with the agencies. They're being very successful in that approach, and that concept is getting a lot of attention in Argentina with the rest of the food banks down there. One of the food banks in India that started out focused on prepared food, of course, lost its resource overnight. They quickly pivoted and started buying and getting donated product to create ration kits for distribution. But they had a number of agencies that were dependent on them for the prepared food, like orphanages and shelter homes. These agencies didn't have their own cooking facilities, so providing them with ration kits, that didn't really help because they didn't have any way to convert that product into meals. And so the food bank, recognizing that pretty early on, decided to undertake a process of putting together its own community kitchens to function as commissaries. And then they were taking donated product and product they would purchase, and they were preparing meals and then delivering them just as they had pre-COVID to those agencies in order to provide a consistent, ongoing meal support process for each day.
I might just ask Jacques then as well, because there are a lot of brilliant examples of the members of FEBA as well who have similar stories, how they've had to adapt in the crisis, and maybe you'd share with the audience some examples from the European network as well, please. Thank you, Chris.
We, as FEBA, we are in existence since 1986. So that's more or less 38 years, I think, that we are there. And we carry 38 years of history as well. I'm not going to make a comparison between the GFN setup and the FEBA setup. Let me just say that never, if there is one thing that crises have done, is that the international networks, GFN and FEBA, have never cooperated as much as they do today. And I'd like to thank you and GFN publicly for that. The challenges have been very much the same, and I think they will even be more important in the coming months, if not in the coming weeks, as the winter approaches Europe. And I've made a little indication in my opening speech of this convention that we are actually parting a little bit from our founders' guidelines because of the circumstances. And I think that's the signal that we are a living organization, and food banks need to adapt to new realities that were not there when FEBA was founded, when the first food bank in France was established, and where the circumstances in those days were evident, fight food waste and feed poor people. The things are changing very fast. From what I gather, I think it's 2 years ago, we had a big exercise in FEBA because we sensed that there was a need to update our charter. We did that exercise. And there was a lot of discussions on, how to phrase the principles in such a way that they could accommodate evolving practices. We did that, and we published the charter. It was approved by a General Assembly. And I feel that today we have to do the job again, because the circumstances basically dictate that. We have to have a fresh look at that. And I think if there is one thing that these crises have generated, I hope this is not my phone. If there is one thing that those crises have generated, it's certainly more solidarity between the various national networks. There is a need of belonging to a movement that we feel is indispensable at preserving society from the most dramatic thing that could happen is people dying from hunger. When the need to have a shelter, when the need to have a shelter that is warm enough to survive is in competition with the need to feed oneself. We, as European societies, we have a big problem on our hands. So there will be, and I think the complexity of FEBA is actually to unite in a democratic way 30 different countries, many different cultures, many different languages, and to try to find a common denominator that would actually be acceptable to all. But that is what building Europe is. Sorry, I've been a little bit more political than what you anticipated, but I think I'm personally not equipped to make a comment on what happened in Luxembourg and what happened in Malta and so on. So I'm not equipped to do that. So I try to transfer what my thoughts on the subject. So let's be positive. Crises have brought also opportunities, and opportunities of revisiting our principles, revisiting our practices, exchanging those practices. Thanks God we have now the opportunity to meet face to face and in person, and we are very sorry for the crisis, that's for sure, but we have to take the positive aspect of it and say that those crises make us grow.
Thank you. And Frederica, we've heard from Chris and Jacques examples of how organisations have adapted, the opportunities that we have seen through the various crises. And with Global Citizen, you're working to catalyse the movement to end extreme poverty. And how has your work had to adapt over the last few years?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting question because I think, yeah, Jack, as you said, right, crises have opportunities, but I think first when COVID hit, and I think for so many of us, for instance, our organization had planned, it was 2020, we wanted to launch a huge campaign, 10 years to go to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We knew at this time that only $350 billion were needed to end extreme poverty. And this is actually not a lot of money, so we had calculated this with the World Bank. We had this series of festivals set up where we wanted to bring governments on stage, make commitments, obviously accompanied with great performances from artists. And then COVID hit and everything had to change, obviously. And not only that live events were no longer an option and we had to make virtual events, but also the fact that we had living proof for how these multiple crises interact and how dependent we are, basically, on everybody. So COVID is and was not only a health crisis, we know how this fueled hunger, how this fueled extreme poverty, inequality, especially gender inequality, and how this all resulted in an education crisis. So what we kind of did is, first of all, pivot. I think that's a word you also used, and said, okay, first of all, we will bring people together, try to generate funding, immediate funding for the WHO. Maybe some of you have seen our virtual event that Lady Gaga hosted, asking all of you to stay at home back in April 2020. And yeah, I think in the next step, we really wanted to show people, not only explain how these multiple crises interact with each other, with explaining content in our website, app, and everywhere, but also obviously give people the chance to take action. And yeah, we did that. And what we kind of found out as well, and I can also speak a bit more about that maybe on the next point, but I think it's more important than ever to show that interconnection, but in times when all news are bad news, and I think many of us probably stopped watching news at some point in the middle of the pandemic, and obviously things didn't get better since the 24th of February, especially for us here in Europe, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine fueling once again hunger, and now even energy prices across the globe. But still people are looking more than ever to hear those positive stories and also kind of show the impact that they can have. And one thing that we've really found, especially on food security, is really kind of putting out case studies there of how certain funding has helped, and to elevate voices of those lives have been changed through that. And we've always felt, working very closely with the World Food Programme, that, for instance, school meals are an amazing positive example of how actually this, certainly for many kids in the world, this is the only warm meal or even meal that they get throughout the day. And this not only helps them learn so much better, right? Because I think none of us can concentrate well with an empty stomach, but also helps especially girls to continue to go to school, because for many families, like, the reason that their girl will get food there is actually a reason to kind of send her there, and the only reason, unfortunately. So kind of enable girls to go to school. We've really worked with that case study a lot, and this is something that we will continue doing in that respect.
Thank you. It's something that came up in the working sessions yesterday, was the need for food banks to share more of the stories of the work that they're doing. And I think it really relates to that point when there's so much bad news. It's great to show actually the hard work and the commitment and the solidarity on the ground. So it's really interesting to hear that parallel. And Brooks, so CAF America is working with both companies and nonprofits on a global scale. How has the work of the companies, or the approach of the companies that you're working with, changed over the last few years?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. It's a very important question. I think since actually the Australian bushfires in 2019 and 2020, which interestingly was the beginning of this. Donors across the US, and I believe that it's also somewhat a global trend, are very, very interested in responding to emergencies and disasters, much more than they had been. And on the corporate side, we're seeing the popularity or rising centrality to the conversation around giving for emergency and disaster relief among corporate responsibility teams, in terms of how they're communicated in annual reports and things like that. And so we have been in the position of responding to that shift by trying to tell the stories of our grantees in a more meaningful way, making sure that we're bringing their work to the center of ours, and understanding that, very similar to GFN, we had to deepen the types of relationships that we have with our grantees and our charities around the world. We have at any point 4,000 to 5,000 active grants out. And so this isn't an easy task, but the way that we've done that is through asking charities how they're doing. And we've done a series of reports and surveys of all of our grantees, and we have various levels of responses, but it was sent to everyone about what the impact of the pandemic has been on them. And we have also asked our donors about what they're doing. And so we have a lot of information about that. Unfortunately, the global charity sector is, as of the end of 2021, which was the last time we surveyed, fairly hollowed out. Over half of the respondents to our survey said they had no financial resources left. From our perspective, they have no reserves left, right? From our perspective, that's important because we can't approve them for large grants if they have no reserves. And so if they're looking to make any sort of transformational investment in themselves, it's more and more difficult for them to even be approved for funding. On the flip side, on the corporate side in particular, as the conversation around disaster and emergency philanthropy has evolved, thankfully, they have gotten more open to being more flexible with grant agreements, understanding when things are changing, allowing us to be more flexible with them, and ensuring that funds can go to where they're needed most and not where, maybe 6 months ago it was decided in some boardroom that it should be going. And so throughout the process of collating and talking about all of the survey responses that we got and talking to our charities, we've really seen a closer relationship develop with them. And really the trend for disaster and emergency philanthropy is indicative of generally a growing flexibility in the corporate donor sector to understand that not only do we need to focus on long-term impact strategy and KPIs and reporting and everything like that, but we can also set aside some of our budget for some more short-term decisions, and more of that is coming to us, which is great. And so, we are proud to work with local organizations around the world, and our model depends on being able to grant directly to organizations on the ground. I think a good example of how it was and where we're trying to move away from is, I think the 24th of February was a Thursday. On Monday, most of our corporate donors had already made multi-million-dollar commitments. Those commitments were typically to large international NGOs that have American affiliates. And I can name them, but I'm sure you all are aware of the usual suspects. What our goal is to move into a world in which they're making their commitments to local organizations, so that they can get the funds directly to the people who are more or closer to the need. And so generally that's the directions that we're seeing, and we've really come along with that and adapted our way of speaking with grantees.
Oh, thank you. It's really interesting to see how that has changed. And then if you don't mind, I'll stay with you and ask, we're a large group of many different European charities who've had an increasingly important role in responding to various crises. As you see, the theme of the conference here is Europe in Crisis, Food Banks in Action. Would you have any recommendations for the members of FEBA and other charities that are in the room in how they work with companies or how they work with grant-making organizations like yourselves?
Definitely. So the first thing to think about when working with someone like CAF America is that our primary responsibility when we make a grant is to make sure that it complies, right? So when we think about cross-border funding and it coming from the US, from our perspective, we're asking you to apply for funding so that we can approve you, right? And so and I actually spoke to a few grantees last night at dinner about this process, including TEFL Deutschland, and how they have dealt with multiple grants coming from multiple different donors of ours that are actually aggregated into the same grant agreement with CAF America. We're not trying to call anyone out, we're not trying to make it difficult, but it does mean that sometimes there have to be changes made or, conversations had about exactly what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And for us, just being open to coming to the table and having that conversation is something that makes the process much easier. You might think that if you're receiving money, it makes sense to be part of that conversation, but you'd be surprised how many organizations might not quite understand exactly what we're doing. And we're not unique in this, right? We are a funder, but any US grant maker is subject to the same regulations and has to go through the same process. For the corporate side, I would say that it's important to think about kind of what kind of motivations a corporate philanthropy team has. They are also employees. They have their own success indicators, and they're trying to find good charities doing good work that align with their missions. So the first thing I would recommend is that you just take a look at what companies are active in your country or your community. I think a good place to look for American companies like that is the American Chambers of Commerce. They list their members publicly, and large companies that do philanthropy in your countries will be listed there. Many of them will work with us, for example. And I don't want to be too shamelessly promotional, but I think that there is a lot of opportunity there. And because when companies think about where they want to give on a long-term basis, they will choose countries and communities where they have a presence. And that's the primary motivation for companies giving. If you are in a community where there are not companies and a disaster happens, you want to be set up to be able to accept their funding, right? So thinking about how you can build the mechanisms and tools to, working with GFN or organizations like CAF America, to be able to say, okay, you're an American company, we have a fiscal sponsor in the US, send your money to this organization and you can get the money in a few weeks, rather than having to go through all of that application process while also responding. The second thing I would say is they give you all the answers in their sustainability reports. So if you find find companies that are talking about food security and are reporting on food security KPIs, you can see exactly what they're looking for and give them exactly what they want. I can tell you that of the grants that we've made to European food banks since 2020, the vast majority of them have been from companies that produce and distribute food and that have publicly committed to food security. And again, they are looking for organizations like you, and it's up to you to find them and meet them.
Thank you. Some very practical advice there for food banks. And Friederike, Global Citizen are very well known for the advocacy work that they do, and I think in the last 2 years, food banks and FEBA have done a lot more in this space, working with governments, working at a European level. What advice or recommendations would you have for food banks that are either involved or maybe considering getting involved in advocacy?
Thank you. Yeah, and you might have talked about that yesterday already a little bit, but it kind of comes back to my point earlier. So this year we've been working with activists since long time, but this year we really took it to a new level, telling these personal stories throughout the year, engaging with people, having them in our content, in our actions, on our stages of our events and all of that. And a really nice example for that is an activist that actually works for Feeding America. Her name is Barbie Izquierdo, and she herself has actually suffered from hunger major parts of her life and wasn't able to feed her kids. I think this woman is 36 years old and has 2 almost grown-up sons. So I think that tells a bit of her story. And she uses this personal story to shine light on the challenges and what it means to actually suffer from hunger in the US, such a rich country. So what we really did, and I think Barbie's example is a good one there, we know we've really took out 2 key learnings from that. The first one is personal stories and experiences have the ability to change minds, not only of the people consuming the content, but also ultimately the policymakers we want to reach with our advocacy. So this essential feedback that these activists provide by handing over a petition, in a one-to-one talk with a member of parliament, whatever it is something that is extremely helpful. And this is a very simple one, but we shouldn't underestimate the power that politicians, or the power of a photo or of, I don't know, a short clip that politicians want to put on their social media, being with activists and all of that. So I feel you as food banks, you have so many powerful stories and also the ability to tell them in a very meaningful and dignified way. So I would say take those voices out. And the second big lesson is for us that one shouldn't address one issue without another. That kind of comes back to my first point of the interrelation of all these crises. So I think while we talk to policymakers about food insecurity and hunger, we should kind of always draw the circle of how this interrelates with other things, other issues, and obviously how their policy decisions ultimately contribute in a way like either hurting or kind of having a positive impact on how these people get their next meal and where it comes from. And I feel being very practical in these recommendations will help policymakers as well. And I think ultimately it is just being loud and being, as you are, a union and being there together. You cannot believe how many letters I've written to G7 countries this year, and still the outcomes of the summit were relatively disappointing, but still I think this is really our moment to come together, empower voices that would usually not be heard, tell those personal stories, and then kind of act together.
Thank you. And we've heard a lot on the panel already about the importance of learning and sharing amongst organisations like the food banks, but also organisations that are different. And, you know, it's brilliant. I think we're all delighted to have this annual convention back in person, giving so much more opportunities to learn and share from each other. And Jacques, I'd love to ask you then, you know, as the president of FEBA, and over the last few years, you've really supported the network in coming together virtually. And how have you seen the importance of learning and sharing from each other amongst the different food banks?
I think your question is actually preempting my closing speech but I will give it to you now. Not the closing speech, but one sentence. My answer will be one sentence and one sentence only. Alone we are invisible. Together we are invincible. I would like to make perhaps some clarification in terms of, this is not really what you asked me to do, but anyway, a clarification of some points for the benefit of our members which are here today. Sometimes FEBA is also used as a bank. In other words, companies, large companies, prefer to have one partner to talk to, and the partner to talk to is FEBA, and FEBA then redistribute the funds for free to the members according either to the wishes of the donor or we should say partner rather than donor, or by virtue of distribution scheme that is approved by the board of directors. So by doing that, FEBA is assuming a contractual obligation with the donors. So when we ask you to give us the feedback that is required by the donor, don't shoot at us. Just do it because it's good for us and it's good for you. Thank you.
Thank you, I think. Okay, we only have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you the same question on learning and sharing and the importance. So Chris, I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Sure, and this is something that, of course, the last couple of years when we couldn't travel and be together has taught us. The need to be able to share best practices and share creative ideas, of course, can be addressed online through webinars and other such gatherings and mechanisms. But there is nothing that beats being able to be together and sitting at dinner together, sitting at lunch together, sitting in the bar after the sessions together, and talking and sharing about what you do. So FEBA reconvening after a couple of years for the annual meeting presents great opportunity. GFN finally is getting around to doing the same thing. We're going to reconvene our Food Bank Leadership Institute this coming March, to the point about shameless promotion, in Mexico City, March 20th to 22nd. Get it in your calendars. And that will be bringing together food bankers and corporate partners and multilateral partners and advocates from all over the world to talk about what's been going on the last few years, just as this FEBA meeting has been doing. But it has led to, in the development of our strategic plan, which our board just approved 2 days ago in Argentina, a big pillar around kind of redesigning and rebuilding the entire information sharing and knowledge sharing platform within GFN, both in terms of in-person gatherings, online gatherings, library building, and that sort of thing. And that all leads to the point about advocacy and the point about being together so that we're not invisible, we're invincible. The last couple of years and the challenges that we've had to face and the responsiveness of the food banks to those challenges has put a lot of spotlights on the concept of food banking. And it now has us in arenas where we haven't been before, like Davos and the G7 and the G20 and the Food Systems Summit last September, the UN Global Crisis Response Group. We now have opportunity that we have earned and that we really need to take care of. It doesn't matter whether the subject is food security and nutrition, food loss and waste, the environmental impact of food loss and waste. Food banks are increasingly and rapidly becoming recognized as the subject matter experts that they are and have been for decades. It's our responsibility now to seize the brightness from those spotlights that are being shown on us, to elucidate the roles that food banks can and do play every day as essential community assets.
Thank you. And Friederike, you mentioned the importance of showing interconnectedness. And I think being able to learn and share between organizations, even organizations that are a bit different, like Global Citizens and Food Banking. Could you speak a bit about the importance of this for us?
Well, I think, as I said, I think after all, it's us coming together and really see where the synergies can be. So we are really happy to work with you guys and see to highlight those voices and kind of learn from each other, because there's, I think, so much. But one thing we can also do together is really hold leaders accountable in that respect, because I think now we are really at a critical point in Germany. The national budget is being negotiated this week, and we really see some dramatic cuts to some of the areas that actually most need money. And I think being able to speak up together and use our voices for what is important instead of competing with each other around resources is really, really important at this point, also given the international situation that is not going to get better, especially for the poorest people in the world.
Thank you. And Brooks, similarly, you work with a very large range and network of nonprofit organisations. You know, have you seen an increase in the importance of them sharing information and working together, especially as we've really had to deal with the various crises over the last few years?
Definitely. I would think that the most salient lesson that we've learned is that the feedback loops of, you know, expressing need, building partnerships, and receiving support have gotten so much shorter. And so, you know, I think the lesson that we would have for anyone receiving money from us, but especially those responding at the community level to crises, is articulating the value to people like us and to funders, and then showing them exactly what's going on in real time, because, you know, the timelines for this have compressed from annual budgets to maybe monthly conversations. And it's really important to make sure that your information is there and your stories are at the table when those decisions are being made.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're just on time. But, you know, I think we heard so many interesting things from our panelists, so thank you so much for sharing and joining us today. From the importance of cooperation and solidarity, from learning from each other, you know, hopefully we'll see much more cooperation and collaboration amongst food banks thanks to the annual convention. So also a huge thank you to FEBA for organising this and getting us all back together again, and to Tafel Deutschland for having us here in Berlin as well. I think we have created many opportunities for food banks to continue to accelerate the impact that we're having, because we know that that is our role and that will be needed, and it will be more important than ever in the coming months and years. So thank you again so much. I hope everybody learned something from our brilliant panelists today. And yeah, thank you all very much.
You can stay on the stage. Stay on the stage. Yeah. So just a few last words. So the FEBA Annual Convention, European Crisis Food Banks in Action, which has been organized by FEBA in collaboration with Tafel Deutschland, has come to an end, at least the sessions via streaming. And we want to thank again all those who attended in Berlin, but also those who watched the streaming, as well as all the speakers for their great insights. Just a very quick reminder to learn more and also live again this event, keep an eye on our website, annualconvention.eurofoodbank.org. And all the video recordings, documents, materials, and presentations will be available soon. And I thank you very much for being with us yesterday and today. See you soon. Thank you very much, and Dankeschön.